Hi, my name is Katie, and this is Yapping About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with the term boycott and can rattle off a few famous ones. For example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Montgomery bus boycott comes to mind for me. It's an effective, nonviolent form of protest that has been used for a very long time. But do you know where the term comes from? If not, you're in the right place because that's the topic for this week's episode. All right, let's get straight into it. No teasers, no little sneak peeks in the intro. We're going right into this story. It takes place in 1880 in County Mayo, Ireland. But first, let's crack open some Guinness. I just have the extra stout one because it's probably meant for right-handed people. Sláinte. But we have to do our background first. However, we do not have time to go through several hundred years worth of background, but that is how long the British have been occupying and oppressing the Irish people at this point in time. And because of this, I just want to preface this episode by saying I'm going to highlight a few important events or themes as background for the story, but just know that this is not an extensive list and there's a lot more at play, but we just do not have time to go over everything. And this is one of our first adventures outside of the US for history, and I'm not an expert. One of the most important things to know is that by the 1800s, around 90% of Irish land was owned by English people, making most of the Irish tenant farmers or renters. And because these landowners were super busy being a part of the British elite, they never really bothered with their land holdings in Ireland, and they would hire people to do that work for them, like collecting rent, dealing with tenants' complaints, and evicting people. They would also raise rents without any regard for what the tenants could actually pay or for what the land could actually produce. The Great Potato Famine had already hit Ireland, which had occurred between 1845 and 1852, where 1 million people died and millions more immigrated to the US and other countries in order to survive. Many starving families, unable to pay rent due to their crops failing, were evicted during this time. And to add to that, the landlords would often have the cottages and homes on the property destroyed so that the families could not return to that land. The inadequate or lack of response from the British authorities fueled even more intense resentment, and Irish nationalism started to gain even more traction. And in part, this all leads to where we find ourselves in 1880. Although Irish farmers began to recover from 1850 to 1870, a combination of bad weather, poor harvests, and falling prices from an economic depression throughout Western Europe in the late 1870s started to give rise to another agricultural catastrophe in Ireland. Another important factor for the story is the push of home rule or self-government for the Irish on domestic and internal affairs while still being a part of the UK, and then England would handle all of the imperial international issues. This movement began in the 1870s with Irish nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell, and it was meant to be kind of a moderate compromise between British occupation and complete independence. And then the Irish National Land League was established by Michael Davitt, a Fenian leader, which we'll be talking about them more in a few weeks, in October of 1879 and was backed by Parnell, who served as the league's president. The Land League was created to defend tenants' rights against landlords and to bring about change using collective nonviolent action like withholding rent during disputes, with the ultimate goal being to get rid of the landlord system. The Land League's initial demands were known as the 3 Fs: fair rent, fixity of tenure, which is the legal right that protects tenants from eviction as long as they pay rent and follow the lease agreements, and free sale. They had several meetings with large turnouts and showed the power in mass demonstrations. Besides withholding rent, other tactics they used were resisting evictions by providing legal aid and political lobbying, including obstructionism, which delayed legislation. It sounds like a little bit like the filibuster system in our government. Their numbers would reach about 200,000 strong. Soon they began to think that this land question could be a stepping stone to independence. Although the Land League did not condone any illegal activity, they didn't necessarily stop their members from committing illegal acts like violence, murder either. During this time period, later known as the Land War, even though it wasn't an actual war, it was just a time period of agitation and resistance. There was also militant riots and assassinations. Between 1879 and 1881, crimes related to the Land War rose from 25% to 58% of all crime in Ireland. To avoid being evicted when the police showed up, some tenants would throw boiling water or cow poop at the officers, or they would put thorny bushes in the windows and doorways to prevent them from entering. Although eviction rates weren't as bad as they were during the famine, they were still around 100,000 families in debt to their landlords because they were not able to pay rent. But my favorite tactic the Land League used, and the reason why we're all here today, is the boycott, which is named after the guy that they actually did it to. Charles Cunningham Boycott was a former British Army officer who served in Ireland, and when he retired from the army, he started working as a land agent. And those are the people that I mentioned earlier who would basically collect all the money from tenants and evict them if they didn't pay for the British landowners. He did this for a guy named Lord Erne, who was a significant landowner in County Mayo and charged insane rents. Boycott evicted a lot of people, oftentimes in bloody, violent affairs. People were fed up with his evictions, and the Mayo branch of the Irish Land League urged or threatened Boycott's own employees to stop working for them, and then encouraged the rest of the village to start a campaign of isolation against Boycott. One of my favorite lines is from an article from the Irish Central, and it said, "Boycott found himself a marked man, not fearing violence, but even worse, the scorn, silence, and disdain of simply everyone he encountered." And that's just really funny to me, to have an entire town ignoring this guy and pretending like he didn't exist. But then Boycott made the mistake of complaining about his treatment to the British Times, and we love primary sources over here, so let's read what he wrote to them. Quote, "Sir, the following detail may be interesting to your readers as exemplifying the power of the Land League. On the 22nd of September, a process server, escorted by police force of 17 men, retreated to my house for protection, followed by a howling mob of people who yelled and hooted at the members of my family. On the ensuing day, September 23rd, the people collected in crowds upon my farm, and some 100 or so came up to my house and ordered off, under threats of ulterior consequences, all of my farm laborers, workmen, and stablemen, commanding them never to work for me again. My herd has been frightened by them into giving up his employment, though he has refused to give up the house he held from me as part of his emolument. Another herd on an off farm has also been compelled to resign his situation. My blacksmith has received a letter threatening him with murder if he does any more work for me, and my laundress has also been ordered to give up my washing. A little boy, 12 years of age, who carried my post bag to and from the neighboring town of Ballinrobe, was struck and threatened on 27th September in order to desist from his work, since which time I've sent my little nephew for my letters, and even he, on 2nd October, was stopped on the road and threatened if he continued to act as my messenger. The shopkeepers have been warned to stop all supplies to my house, and I have just received a message from the postmistress to say that the telegraph messenger was stopped and threatened on the road when bringing out a message to me that she does not think it safe to send any more telegrams which may come from me in the future, for fear they should be abstracted and the messenger injured. My farm is public property. The people wander over it with impunity. My crops are trampled upon, carried away in quantities, and destroyed wholesale. The locks of my gates are smashed, the gates thrown open, the walls thrown down, and the stock driven out into the roads. I can get no workmen to do anything, and my ruin is openly avowed as the object of the Land League unless I throw up everything and leave the country. I say nothing about the danger of my own life, which is apparent to anybody who knows the country." End quote. This takes off in England, and soon they're raising funds for Boycott, and a group of 50 Ulster loyalists from the north of Ireland come down to volunteer to work on Boycott's farm. It becomes such a big deal that these volunteers have to be guarded by about 1,000 Royal Irish constables. And the real kicker is that all of this cost about £10,000, all to harvest about 350 pounds worth of crop. Teamwork makes the dream work, or whatever it is they say. But the Land League's tactics work, and Boycott leaves Ireland in December of 1880 in disgrace. And now his name forever lives on in infamy. And for all you word freaks out there, this is known as an eponym, when a discovery, invention, place, or movement is named after basically a noun. And it first appeared in the dictionary called a New English Dictionary based on historical principles, later known as the Oxford English Dictionary, in 1888. Boycotting gave a lot of power back to the peasants and tenants, and by the end of 1880, there were boycotts happening all over Ireland. But sadly, this story doesn't end with the landlords getting kicked out and Ireland being free of British rule. The British government passes the Coercion Act of 1881, which gives them the right to arrest and imprison anyone without trial. The Land League responds by employing a tactic called moonlighting, where they hold mock funerals at the homes of people not supportive of the League, posing both as a threat and a marker of those to ostracize from the community. Not long after all of this, Michael Devitt, the creator of the Land League, and most of its leaders were imprisoned in October 1881 in Dublin. But don't you fret. See, they had the Ladies' Land League created. They had actually set this up earlier in 1881 because they kind of had a feeling that something was going to happen to the male leaders of the league. So when they all went to jail, the women took over running the Land League, which I feel like is a pretty cool move in the late 1800s because I feel like women were very underestimated at this time and not thought that they were capable of running a resistance group like this. It was the first political association of Irish women, well, at least official or public facing. I'm sure women were involved in politics way before this. They had around 321 branches in Ireland and some branches in England, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And as we'll see in a few episodes from now, a lot of Irish resistance and independence groups got a lot of funding from the United States. They provided grants to evicted tenants and to families who had family members in jail because of the Coercion Act. They also came up with the idea of kind of like prefabricated huts for evicted tenants that could easily be put up and taken down. They were also responsible for getting the Land League's newspaper called United Ireland printed, even though the British government had tried to shut it down. While the men were in jail, a no rent manifesto went around urging tenants to withhold their rent until everyone was released from jail. Later in 1881, the Land Act was passed, which granted Ireland the 3 Fs that they had been fighting for: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale. It also allowed tenants to sell their interest and any improvements to their holdings without landlord interference. There was the Cumanum Treaty, which included the Settled Land Act. This allowed poor tenants to have their rent debts erased and apply to the land court to have a fair rent fixed. Parnell, the president of the Land League, felt like these changes were enough to call off the land war and disband all of the land leagues. He would go on to focus his efforts in achieving home rule. But speaking of Charles Parnell, there was a couple of interesting kind of like gossipy side stories that I thought you might be interested in, and we'll kind of wrap up this episode with these. The first one was that Parnell was falsely accused by the London Times in 1887 of sanctioning Fenian terrorism and murder during the Land League agitation. The Times was going off of forged letters to make their case, but Parnell was acquitted of all charges in 1890, but they seemed to be out to get this guy. However, it would be his own actions that would get him in the end, and he kind of ends up ruining his own political future. A man by the name of Captain William Henry O'Shea joined Parnell's Home Rule Party and won a seat in the House of Commons. O'Shea was married to a woman named Catherine, who went by Kitty, but they did not have a great marriage, and by the time O'Shea was in the House of Commons, they weren't really living together as husband and wife, but were still legally married. They rarely saw each other, but on one such occasion, O'Shea was pretty much gushing about how great Parnell was to Kitty, so much so that Kitty wanted to go meet Parnell for herself. She did, and they quickly became lovers. They had 3 children together, and everything was kept hidden until O'Shea filed for divorce in 1890 and presented himself as kind of like a duped, wronged husband, although it was more likely that he knew about the affair the whole time. And it seems like the London Times used this opportunity to kind of get back at Parnell over their recent defeat in court about the forged letters. They wrote about the homewrecker Parnell almost daily, and the political fallout from this was instant. The Prime Minister and Catholic bishops of Ireland asked Parnell to resign, but he refused. His refusal leads to a split in his party between his supporters and detractors, and he thought that he could prove himself by winning in the next elections, but the results were not in his favor, and that ended his political career. On a bright note, he was able to marry Kitty in June of 1891 after her divorce was finalized, but he was kind of a broken man and his health declined sharply, and he died suddenly in October of the same year. He was once known as the uncrowned King of Ireland, and he was only 45 years old when he passed. The Irish National Land League was reestablished under a new name in 1882, and it's not until 1922 that Irish becomes a free state with self-governance, and not until 1949 that it is officially declared a republic, completely leaving the British Commonwealth. Whomstever. I do want to note that there are still 6 Irish counties in the north that are a part of the UK to this day. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories we are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. See you next week. Bye.